LEROY Street Studio Architecture, co-founded about a decade ago. So in a nutshell, Hester Street Collaborative, what we do is we try to help communities have a voice in how their public spaces are shaped, and that happens in a lot of different ways. But I was looking at some of the other Creative Morning talks, and I was thinking about, well, why did I start doing this work to begin with? And it kind of brought me back to my childhood. I grew up in Rust Belt cities like Buffalo and Detroit, and one thing a lot of those cities have in common is that there's this sort of vacant and underutilized old industrial infrastructure that I was sort of fascinated with as a young person. And I spent a lot of time actually kind of navigating between the suburbs I grew up in and then these places that had been sort of left behind in cities, and sort of becoming curious about how those cities were shaped and what were the sort of unseen forces that created these incredible kind of decaying landscapes, but that also kind of isolated them from the more kind of often what I found alienating and sort of isolated suburbs. And then pair that with having a kind of wacky art teacher mom who was encouraging us to sort of think of our home as our own studio. So my brothers and I were constantly kind of like inventing our own creative play environments and building like wacky treat forts and adventure playgrounds and like carving out the monumental snowdrifts that form in Buffalo in the winter. And so I started to think of sort of, for me, the kind of creative underpinnings of Hester Street as being both this fascination with kind of the built environment, but also just like the joy of creating these kind of wacky and fun play environments. So flash forward, I went to study architecture, and then right out of school went to work for LEROY Street Studio. And what was really great about working for them is they're a practice that's really dedicated to thinking about how buildings come together and that sort of materiality and how buildings are made. And so I kind of really got into just learning about kind of how things come together in that way. This is just some slides of their work. But what really excited me about LEROY Street Studio when I went to work for them is that they were doing this incredible project in East New York where they were working on an affordable housing development. And I don't know how many of you guys have been out to East New York, but it's still pretty tough neighborhood, packs of wild dogs roaming the streets, things like that. And what was particularly inspiring about this project was that they were organizing a participatory process that involved the future residents of the building and sort of making the public spaces. And for me, when I saw that project, something clicked. I thought, this is how I want to apply my architecture education. I want to work with communities on projects where they have a hand in making their environment. And also this idea that, civic participation doesn't need to be about, participating in local politics. It can also be about making your environment and having a sort of creative form of civic engagement. So when LEROY Street Studio moved from LEROY Street in the West Village down to Hester Street in CHINATOWN or the Lower East Side, whoever, depends on who you ask, we transformed this old storefront, and you can see one major part of that renovation was actually opening up the storefront to the street and creating a presence on the street. And I think that was very kind of also formative in thinking about Hester Street, in that we sort of opened up the practice to the street and wanted to have a relationship to what was happening in the neighborhood. And I think being in a storefront, you're very much kind of integrated into the street life of Chinatown, which, as I'm sure most of you know, is very, very much, happens on the street. Life sort of happens and unfolds everywhere around you. And whether it's, the throngs of middle school kids coming out of school at 3 o'clock across the street from our office, or it's, the barber shop next door, or the sausage factory next, there's a lot happening in our neighborhood. And so we started to think about, well, how do we have a relationship to this place? We're here, rather than, as we're thinking about how do we kind of create a kind of community-focused practice, how do we relate to the place that we're in, rather than thinking about, okay, let's do a project in Africa, or let's do a project in Asia somewhere. Let's think about where we're based and kind of create this laboratory here in our own backyard. And so we started really simply. We just walked across the street. There's a middle school, which now has two high schools and a middle school in it, but when we moved down there, it was just a middle school, MS 131, and we just walked across the street and spoke to the principal and said, hey, we want to have a relationship with your school. We'd love to work with the kids in your school on projects. What's useful? And I think that approach of sort of walking across the street or having conversations with people in our backyard has been very central to how we think about the work. So, we started out doing kind of, everything from art installations, murals, projects for both the school campus, but also for the larger community with our middle school students. You can see this is a dragon lantern for Lunar New Year. We do Lunar New Year lanterns with the students every year. This one's made out of recycled materials, and a mural, and then the students are building benches for their school commons. And then, from that one relationship, we got invited to work in other schools in the neighborhood. So this is PS 134, and the principal approached us and said, hey, we want to build an outdoor classroom and a vacant community garden next door to the school. So we've been working with that school since 2004 to each year the students create another piece of the garden and contribute to the environment, and we're working with second graders through fifth graders. And so then thinking about, well, how do you make this kind of project accessible to that age? What can a second grader build? What can a fifth grader build? So you can see everything that's out here in the classroom has been built by students with the help of designers and architects. And then they're growing food as well. And a lot of these kids are kind of tasting some of this food for the first time. And then you can see we let kids use power tools too, which they really, really like. And then from there we were invited to work in a high school and do a lot of actually screen printing with our high school students. And again, so there's this thinking about how do we do something that's going to be really age appropriate and exciting to the age of student that we're working with. And high school students love to screen print, and once we kind of figured that out, we're like, okay, we're just doing screen printing with these guys. They're totally into it. And so much so that some of our students actually have been coming back since graduating and launching their own t-shirt lines out of our studio, and we turned the whole back of our office into a screen printing studio for kids. So then from this work in schools, which was sort of how we started, we began to think, well, how do we relate to the rest of the neighborhood as well? And we started, again, just having conversations with, starting really with the youth and the residents in the neighborhood, but then kind of starting to talk to community-based organizations. And one thing that's really exciting and unique, I think, about the Lower East Side in Chinatown is there's a very, long-standing tradition of activism and community-based organizations really rooted in that neighborhood. So there's a lot to connect to there, and folks who really understand the needs in the neighborhood in a way that, as designers and architects, we don't necessarily have that same either history with the neighborhood or knowledge of the people that live there. So we've begun to work really closely with a lot of organizers and tenant leaders and other organizations. And then found that there was a need also to connect to the elected officials. So once we started to understand what some of the needs were on the ground, we could say, okay, well, who can help us make these things happen? So a lot of elected official heads there. We like Margaret Chin and Daniel Squadron, so they got the biggest heads. And then figuring out also on the decision-making end, who are the city agencies that we need to work with, especially when we're looking at public spaces to make these projects that people in the neighborhood are telling us they want to see happen. So as we began to talk to our neighbors and hear more about what was happening in the neighborhood, we kept hearing over and over again, there are all of these underutilized public spaces in the neighborhood, and there's an incredible need for more viable open space, for green space, because of the density in the neighborhood. And actually, I didn't realize until we started to research it that Chinatown, the Lower East Side, has one of the least amounts of open space per resident in the city, and that's largely because of the density. So this is, on the top, that's Sarah D. Roosevelt Park, which is this kind of long park that runs between Canal and Houston, the Allen and Pike Street pedestrian malls, and the East River waterfront. They're just a few of the sites we've been working in. And then this is just a little slide about density, just to give you a sense of how dense the neighborhood is. So, I'll talk a little bit about our approach. So one site we've been working on really closely lately, and with LMCC as well, has been the East River waterfront. And so in particular, the piers, which are located right above East River Park, or right below East River Park. So they're mammoth. And again, this work came out of conversations with people in the neighborhood who were saying, why don't we have access to our waterfront? Look at the west side. There's this incredible park. Why this kind of inequity with the East River, right? And because people have been so disconnected for so long, we needed to create these kind of graphics that showed people actually how much space is there. So you can see Pier 36 is actually as long as the Empire State Building is high. Who knew? And then kind of working with residents to create a vision for their waterfront. So this is a proposal for actually transforming the piers into a park based on community input. And then taking those recommendations and kind of creating a report that we could share out with elected officials and agency reps. And then also developing a poster campaign. Thank you, Meryl. Where's Meryl? She designed those posters. With photographs of people from the neighborhood kind of speaking to what their needs are on the waterfront, advocating for the recommendations in the People's Plan. And then also kind of continuing to push those recommendations further and look even more closely at Pier 42 in particular, which is on the northernmost portion of the site, and creating this mobile, this is called the Waterfront on Wheels. It's a bikeable model of the East River waterfront that gets collapsed and attached to a bike trailer, and it goes where it needs to go to get input from the people. And then kind of working again, like with people in the neighborhood to envision what their dream park would look like. And again, we're not trying to ask like kids to design the park, we're trying to get ideas from them that we can channel to designers to create this bigger vision. Again, at PS 134, working with kids and trying to understand what do they want to see for their outdoor classroom, what do they want to make, what do they want to build. And then again, breaking down the process into a series of steps that are age appropriate, that they can have access to. This is the students creating birdhouses for the space, and again, they're learning about birds, they're learning about how to build. These are the stools for the garden so that they can actually have class out there that they all designed and built that are inspired by things that live or grow in the garden, and they're made from electrical conduit and wood. Signage for the garden. And then ultimately, we have this space now that the school uses as an outdoor classroom. There's Dylan, our awesome community design director, teaching a class out there, and then the shed that we built with the students as well, which is where they store their garden tools, but also serves as the front of class. So. And then the Allen and Pike Street Mall. So if you're familiar, it's this kind of long linear corridor that stretches from Houston to the waterfront. And again, it's just been this kind of like dead space for many years, and people in the neighborhood were coming together and saying, well, why can't we do something there? Why can't we utilize that space? So again, the process started with like hearing these kind of stories from people in the neighborhood about the neighborhood, but also what they want to see there, but also then connecting to kind of the history of immigration in the neighborhood and thinking about how the culture and history of a place can also be channeled into kind of reimagining what it could be. Doing kind of mapping studies, site analysis of this long kind of corridor. And then again, developing these tools, in this case, for community to weigh in on what they'd like to see there. So this is actually this voting board that has these different kind of visions for what could happen there, and people can kind of write into it, draw into it, and it's in Chinese, Spanish, and English. So again, it's taking the process out into the community rather than sort of cloistering it within the agencies. Having design charrettes. And then often in these kind of larger public space projects, we know that the end goal is many years off. So what can we do in the meantime to activate those spaces and to kind of keep attention on those spaces to get community involved? So things like temporary art and design installations are a big part of our kind of toolkit as well. So these are these swinging compass benches, they're called, that kind of rotate on a pivot. They're made from old railroad ties. And they rotate over maps of the neighborhood that have different representations of the neighborhood on them that we designed with some artists that we work with. And then also kind of advocating for safer transportation along the malls. We had the bike lanes moved from along the parked cars on the outside of the street, and now they're protected and kind of along the inside of the malls, if any of you guys have biked along there, which is a big improvement. Thinking about underutilized buildings. So this is an old comfort station that's been empty for years at the intersection of Delancey and Allen. So we're doing a study now to think about how that space could be re-envisioned for the community, what programming could happen there, but what is also the architectural kind of intervention there. And then also just running programs with teenagers. We've been doing a cycling program with 8 other organizations in the neighborhood called Local Spokes, where we're just getting kids out on the neighborhood and exploring the neighborhood through bikes and thinking about the sustainable transportation infrastructure of the neighborhood. And then so, having worked in these kind of different isolated park sites, we started to see a larger sort of systemic need for a toolkit that, we saw the same kind of issues coming up over and over again. People don't understand how they can have a voice and how their neighborhood spaces are shaped. Maybe we need a toolkit that can live within the Parks Department that will make that process easier. Hence, people make parks. So we started to think about what are some of the tools that we've used in these various park sites that we could sort of kind of cull together into a toolkit and share out citywide. So this idea that what we're doing citywide is always informed by the local work in some ways. So this is a story map that's in Spanish, Chinese, and English where we bring it out to a park for a day and people can just kind of write their stories about the space that is going to be renovated, or they can give their suggestions. But again, this idea of taking the process out to the community and providing tools for like an easy way into re-envisioning a space. And then on the bottom right here, this is elderly folks in Chinatown making these lanterns with their wishes for the park written onto them and teaching kids how to make them. And then also sometimes just kind of breaking down the process and diagramming it so that it's legible. So again, thinking about all these kind of unseen forces that shape the place we live in and how do we make that more transparent, more accessible. And then again, creating this toolkit. This is 8 ways you can participate in your park design, which we're working with Partnerships for Parks to circulate citywide. And they're a citywide organization that has the reach to be able to do that and to work with communities all over. And then we launched a website as well. So you can look up your park and see if there's a capital improvement plan for it, and then kind of download these different tools and processes for getting involved. This is a video about how to do your own story map. And then we launched it last fall and had a big event for that. So, with any Hester Street project, there's kind of these somewhat consistent ingredients that are part of the process. So each project always starts with people, right? What do people in a neighborhood want to see? What are their concerns? And I think that approach is really important to us, that there's a distinction between, as architects and designers and artists, we're not kind of coming in with a pre-baked idea and saying, this is what the neighborhood needs. We're really trying to have that emerge out of conversations with people who live there and who stand to be affected by changes in their neighborhood. And then there's always some sort of input gathering, kind of visioning process at the beginning that guides that. And then there's sometimes, the materials are print or web-based materials. But sometimes there are these kind of small built projects that get kind of deployed in a neighborhood or taken out to gather input. And these kind of like mini little pop-up. The project in the middle is a pop-up center for an organization called Fierce. They're an LGBTQ youth organization that wants to create a youth center on the west side, and so they have this like, you know, hot pink little pop-up center that they can take out into the West Village to envision with constituents there. And then sometimes, you know, there's a need to create these kind of public art projects along the way, so murals, other kind of signage. And then sometimes there are more kind of built-out installations or architectural proposals for a site. But again, I think, you know, it really is about kind of taking the temperature of what the community wants to see and what there's a receptivity for within the city, and trying to kind of find the right balance of ingredients, and that it never really looks the same for any project. There's never really a cookie-cutter approach. It's always sort of emerges out of the constraints or the needs of a project. And so, you know, in some cases, we might find, you know, we gave more kind of ownership to kids in the design process and it didn't work out. So that failure is really a part of that kind of cooking up public spaces. It's really integral to it that, you know, we're kind of constantly trying out these different combinations of ingredients, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. But there's always kind of a learning process, and I think that's one of the things that continues to stay inspiring for me, is that I'm always learning from the people that we partner with, and I think vice versa, there's this kind of constant dialogue that we're in. And because we're kind of all in this neighborhood together, it allows that conversation to happen in a really authentic way. And so rather than sort of saying there is like one way of doing a successful Hester Street project, I think we've moved more towards this idea of asking ourselves certain questions along the way, and that we found that these questions guide our work. This is actually a set of questions that we developed with CUP, Center for Urban Pedagogy, for a talk that we did together, and I like to kind of come back to them because I think that this is a good way of kind of orienting ourselves and staying true to the needs of the communities that we work with. So we ask, is there a need for this project? And I find often that question doesn't come up. And for, you know, a lot of like sort of, you know, public space interventions you see in the city, like, you know, are people asking that question? Is there a need? Is somebody asking for this first and foremost? And how do I know, right? Who's already working on the issue? So that might be a city agency, that might be another organization. And what can I bring to the table? Whether it's a roaming model of the waterfront that gets attached to a bike, or, you know, a printed tool, or just a process. Who is it for? And what's the social good that we're trying to achieve? So for us, also being a nonprofit, we really like to think about the impact of our work, and how do we know that we're having impact? How do we know that we're successful in the work that we're trying to do? And what kind of end product would help achieve it? So again, this idea of not prescribing at the beginning of the process what the end outcome will look like, but really allowing it to unfold and emerge. So thanks very much, everyone.